So yeah, hi, I'm Zihan, and I'm currently a third-year PhD student at UCI, supervised by Professor Shuang Zhao. And my research focuses on physics-based. Okay, no problem. Yeah, my research focuses on physics-based rendering and differentiable rendering. And today's topics of my talk is PSDR enzyme, physics-based differentiable rendering using Enzyme. So I'll start with some introduction before going into the details. So what is physics-based rendering? It is a process of synthesizing photorealistic images from 3D scenes. It is widely used in many areas, including movies, games, and architectural design. And the research in rendering has been developing for decades and has achieved huge progress. So in physics-based rendering, we were given a scene description that describes where the objects are placed, what their shape are, and what they are made of, and how the camera and the light sources are positioned. Then we can call the rendering algorithm and will perform the computation which results in a photorealistic image. We can think of this rendering process as a mapping I, which maps the input scene vector theta to an output image vector I. And rendering is a process that's from left to right, which has been thoroughly studied. And what we are focused on is a process from right to left, which is called inverse rendering. And in this problem, we're given one or a few images taken in the scene, and we want to recover a description of the scene. Here we are looking for a hypothetical inverse function of I. And inverse rendering has numerous applications in computer vision, robotics, and computational imaging, etc. And one example of inverse rendering is shape and material reconstruction, which is a core problem in computer vision. Basically, we take a bunch of photos of an object, and we want to build a digital model out of it. And this is a fairly classic problem in computer vision. And due to current progress in differentiable rendering, we can solve this problem with much higher complexity and with much higher reconstruction qualities. And another type of applications requires complex light transport to be handled is computational fabrication. And these days, we have fairly complicated color 3D printers so we can control how we mix different types of ink in each voxel during the printing process. And naturally, the question becomes, how can we determine the material configuration so that we can reach a desired appearance, desired final appearance? And this becomes an inverse rendering problem where things like subsurface scattering has to be considered. Because normally, the printing material is not 100% opaque. If we neglect the subsurface scattering effect, the printed appearance will not match the target very well. So how to solve the inverse rendering problem? So in general, inverse rendering problem, the rendering function I is far too complex to invert. So instead, we can convert it to an optimization problem. And in this problem, we are given a target image I hat. We want to find the theta that produces an image that best matches this target. So to do this, we can define an objective function or a loss function, which quantifies the distance between the current rendering and the target. We can then try to minimize an objective function with respect to the scene parameter. Generally, this problem doesn't have a closed form solution, so instead we resort to the gradient-based optimization. So gradient-based optimization requires us to evaluate the gradient of the objective function L with respect to the parameter theta. So by applying the chain rule, we can decompose it into two components, where the second component requires the differentiating the rendering function I. So differentiable rendering is all about computing this derivative of the rendering function with respect to the scene parameter. So on the left, we show a 4 rendering results, which is a nice dining room with the light sources outside. And on the right, we visualize a derivative image with respect to the sun location. And next, I will introduce our system. So before introducing the differentiable part, I will start with introducing how forward rendering works. So here we show the data structure of this simple scene, which is a classic Cornell box scene. And the scene consists of a camera, a few objects with different shape. Each object may have different materials, and there is a meter on the ceiling. So the parameter we can optimize can be the transformation matrices of the camera and the shapes, the vertex positions of the shapes, the color of the material, or the emittance of the light. So we can then pass the scene objects to a rendering algorithm and get an image shown on the right. And here's a brief overview of the forward rendering process. So the pixel value of the image on the camera film is the energy of all the light passes that come from the emitter reflected by the object and finally arrive at that pixel. So we show a light pass on the right, which has 4 light vertices. And the pass contribution is the amount of the radiant power carried by individual light pass. And it is a product of the per vertex contribution of each vertex of the light pass. So we can estimate this pixel value by doing a light transport simulation using a technique called Monte Carlo integration. Basically, the pixel value approximately equals to a weighted average of the pass contributions of n light passes samples in the scene. So n is the number of light passes, and f is the measurement contribution functions, and p is the probability density of the sampled pass. The derivative of the pixel value with respect to the parameter theta approximately equals to a weighted average of the derivative of the measurement function, measurement contribution function. And generally, a rendering equation is an integral with discontinuity. Differentiating this integral will result in a boundary term on the right-hand side. But since this boundary part is not the performance bottleneck, so we will omit it here for simplicity. And also notice that the sampling probabilities are independent with respect to the parameter theta, so we don't need to compute the derivative here. And on the right, we show the gradient image with respect to the reflectance of the left wall. Here we show the computational graph of the path contribution functions on the left and the corresponding pseudocode on the right. So the parameter theta is generally a vector that is a stack of like vertex positions, material properties, or textures, etc. And since the geometry of the objects can evolve along with this parameter theta, so do the path vertices. Also, the theta can also control the material properties and further control the behavior of the function fv. This computational dependency is denoted in blue arrow. And to simplify this problem, we assume that they're independent. Note here that the yellow arrow shown here only represents their order and doesn't imply any computational dependency. There are some challenges faced by differentiable rendering. First, the length of the light path is generally not fixed and can be very large. And also, the function fv is a virtual function and can involve complex computations. So we can use Enzyme to differentiate the whole path contribution functions, but it will lead to very long compilation time, which is 10 to 20 minutes in our cases. And also, Enzyme cannot statically bound the size of the for loop, so it will reallocate the memory dynamically, and this presumably slow the program as well. And we observed that the graph has a layered structures that consist of 4 layers, and it has a simple data dependencies. And also the connection between the layer 2 and layer 3 is very sparse, since each fv depends only on at most 3 xn. So our idea is to backpropagate the gradients layer by layer by exploiting the structure of the computational graph. And we show the derivative code on the right. First, we run a forward pass, which is a mirror of the original code, and catch the variables that will be used in the backward pass. And then we run a backward pass, which inverts the instructions in the forward pass. We label the code where enzyme AD comes into play. Basically, we pre-allocate the memory and move enzyme autodiff API call inside the for loop. So this improves the compilation and runtime efficiency and also the debuggability of our code. And to compute the derivative, we have to deep copy the primal scene objects for shadows. This makes sure that the shadow have the exact structure and layout as a primal object. So we can also make multiple copies of shadows for multiple threads and merge the gradient at the end. So we compared our methods with the baseline where we differentiate the whole program for a variety scene setting. And it demonstrates 3 to 5 times speed up as shown in this plot. And next, I will show some inverse render examples that demonstrate the effectiveness of our system. So to recap, in our example, we were given a bunch of photos taken from different angles around the objects. And we used stochastic gradient descent to optimize the shapes that we're interested in. And the first example contains a 3D world map where we jointly optimize the geometry and the texture. The inverse rendering optimization, optimizations with our system successfully recover the detailed geometry and the texture. Yeah, the second example contains a homogeneous translucent peak with detailed boundary geometry. We use 20 target image with one shown here to optimize the shape. Yeah. After a few hundred iterations, the geometry converges to the target. Yes, in the final section, I'd like to list some nice-to-have features of Enzyme which we can benefit from when developing our system. So rendering system heavily relies on virtual functions, and there can be many objects with different shape present in the scene, like spheres, cylinder, meshes, etc. And each object can also have different materials, like diffuse materials, conductor, dielectric, etc. So virtual function is implemented using virtual table in C++, which is initialized in the object's constructor during runtime. And Enzyme currently cannot differentiate through it transparently. It requires some rather complex manual modifications of the virtual function table in order to make it work. And we bypass this problem by dispatching the function call manually, which led the enzyme to see all the functions that define the derived class and further differentiating them. Yeah, another feature that we can benefit from is better compilation efficiency for differentiating large system. Render system is fairly complicated and involve multiple components across different files. The render algorithm will need to access the code and data of all these components during the rendering process. And differentiating the rendering functions usually requires us to merge the source file into a single file and then pass it to Enzyme library after link time optimizations. And this process could take extremely long time and increase the edit compile run cycle during the development. And also it makes the grading code hard to debug due to their complexity. And we try to bypass this problem by split the grading code into different compilation units and using the custom gradient feature of the enzyme. Yeah, since the derivative code are split into different compilation units, we can leverage CMake or make to parallelize the enzyme passes. Yeah, but it still requires many boilerplate codes to make it work. A new API or syntax trigger would be beneficial for this use case. Inverse rendering problem typically aim to solve for a subset of scene parameters. And the parameters need to be differentiated with respect to differ from problem to problem. Thus, allow runtime required grads is useful. Like this example shown in the slides, we only want to optimize the paint on the wall. However, Enzyme will compute the gradients for all scene objects, which incurs some computational overhead. Especially, there is a really complex objects present in the scene. A runtime flag in Enzyme, like the required grads in PyTorch, would be nice to have for such use case. This is end of my talks, and thanks for your attentions.
Thank you.
I can take any questions.
Any questions?
I have two questions actually. Have you compared the performance of your system to the Matsuba rendering system for differential rendering from Jakob Wenzel?
We haven't compared that yet, because their implementation is a GPU's implementation. Our only works on CPU using the CPU versions of the Enzyme. Yeah.
Do you have a intuition how the performance of the current current compilation pipeline compares to something like Dr. JIT?
Sorry.
Yes.
Do you have an intuition how the performance of your current compilation pipeline compares to something like Dr. JIT, the JIT engine they made to make the differential programming, the differential rendering for them much more efficient?
So yeah, I can give more context. So, okay, grab this. So, I'm just going to repeat the question. So the question is the question is to compare the performance between our Enzyme-based implementation and the Mitsuba renderer, which is currently Dr. JIT based. So the short answer is that we haven't compared the Dr. JIT can compile a CPU version. We haven't compared to that. However, we have compared to a earlier Inoki-based implementation of it. Our system can achieve a similar level of performance for a GPU-based Inoki renderer with a relatively, moderate amount of threads. When you get huge amount of threads, the GPU platform has an advantage. But at a moderate amount of threads, our system offers a similar level of performance as the Inoki-based, basically an earlier version of Mitsuba. Thank you.
Any more questions? Comments?
More of a comment than a specific question. When you said earlier on some of the virtual function table stuff, I'm curious what you did as that rewriting, and we actually relatively recently introduced, again, this should be made with much better documentation in syntactic sugar, but a special sort of _ enzyme virtual reverse pointer. So if you're doing reverse mode, it will, given a virtual method table, give you the corresponding derivative virtual method table. Did you do something similar to that, or did you sort of inside of the code itself force it to say, I know what the virtual methods are, and here's a switch statement?
Yeah, we pretty much had a switch statement.
Okay, yeah. Fair.
Okay, any more questions? Thank you. So about the requires grad example that you showed at the end, usually the way I know it being done is that you have some variables that require grad, some variables that don't require grad. But it looks like in your case, you want a portion of an array to require grad and the rest of it to not do that. Is there a reason why you can't just factor that part out into a separate input variable and then make that active? Wouldn't that do exactly what you want?
So yeah, just again to clarify, in theory, yes, we can, because the scene file is a big list involves a big list of parameters, we could like define some syntax so that it's easy to specify something to be differentiated. The challenge is that every sim file is shares a similar format, but for different problems. So in one problem we want to differentiate like this painting. In another one we might want to differentiate the position of the chair. So for one sim file, different problems will require differentiating different objects in the scene. So it can be handled by the user using like a manual checks, if like setting some flags, but this has to be done repeatedly. So this is what we meant by kind of if there's a like language level or compiler level support, so that once the user specifies some runtime flag, then the compiler will do the if this is required, then I'm gonna differentiate it. Otherwise, I'm gonna skip. Right now, we're kind of doing this manually. We're saying that, okay, since this is pretty much a runtime thing, since it's at compilation time, it's hard to pre-require like only for the painting to be differentiated. So that's the kind of the one of the annoyances on the user side, since we have to, if we are to skipping the other parameters, we have to do a lot of manual checks like this.
Thank you. Any more questions? Any more comments? Then let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.
And our